Okay, let's get started. We got some good material to cover today. So, of course, we'll have really good lectures next week on Monday. No, we don't. Spring break. Don't come. But the 31st is the first Monday after spring break, and then 2 days after that is midterm number 2, if you can believe it. All the material from midterm 1 up through Monday the 31st lecture on the triple bind. Is this like much louder than usual, or is it okay? Okay, good. So on the afternoon of Monday, March 31st is a review session. A lot of you came to the review session run by the GSIs before the first midterm, and so this review session is Monday, March 31st, 4 o'clock in Morgan 101. Morgan is a fairly nice building near Tolman Hall, which is a fairly unnice building. So 101 Morgan, we'll post it on BSpace if it isn't up there already. 4 o'clock to 5:30 or so, review session, bring your questions about the material for the second segment of the course. The second midterm will be pretty much the same format as the first. 8 or 9 multiple choice questions, 8 or 9 or 10 fill in the blanks, choice of compare and contrast, choice of essay question. But on this new material, it won't be cumulative back to the first part of the course. So today we're going to talk about bipolar disorder. Now, for most of history, this was viewed as a condition that didn't start until the middle of the teenage years at earliest. The average age of onset is still in the 20s in the United States, and in most of the world as far as we know. This is a mood disorder where a person has depressions. We talked about depression last time. But what makes bipolar disorder bipolar up and down is those depressions alternate with, in some unique pattern, unique to the individual, can't predict this across people, alternates with periods of what we call mania, very inflated or grandiose mood. But as we'll talk about very shortly, it's a big mistake to think of you either have a depression or you have a mania. Most people with bipolar disorder end up in what's called a mixed episode or mixed state, where you have some features of depression and some features of mania going on at the same time, and we'll talk about that. So what is a mania or a manic episode? In some ways, it's pretty much the opposite of what we talked about last time as to what a major depressive episode looks like. So instead of despondent, sad mood, you're feeling pretty good about yourself in the world. Instead of, as in some cases of depression, you can't get up, hypersomnia, most people experiencing manias are getting just a couple hours of sleep a night and feeling pretty energized. Of course, that can't go on forever. Instead of hardly being able to talk because you're so pessimistic, in hypomanic or manic episodes, people are really gabby. They've got a lot to say, and they might call you at 4 in the morning with their ideas and piss you off because they can't stop talking. Instead of your thinking being slowed and kind of mired in molasses, ideas in mania come fast and furious. One of the features is that, remember, in depression, motivation was low for activities that usually got you going. In mania, seemingly the opposite, you've never been more into your work projects or sex or food or pleasurable activities. Manias progress in stages, as we'll talk about a little bit. There's not like an exact cutoff. They kind of go up. And as a mania gets more severe, the impulsivity and the poor judgment can really take over. So people who get beyond the first phases of mania can do pretty dangerous, reckless things. Yeah, question? So in the very early stages of mania, a person is just talking really fast, a lot of ideas, and you better follow me. And then as the mania gets more severe, the ideas tend to get less rational, and they tend to get a little more out there. So it depends on where you are in that manic episode. And the DSM says you've got to have these symptoms pretty much every day for at least a week. Because what could produce manic symptoms for a day or two? If you overdose on steroids. One of the side effects of people who take steroids, not just Major League Baseball players to get big, but if you take steroids for medical reasons, hypomania can result. When is it just talkativeness and impulsivity of ADHD, and when is it mania? A big question. We might talk about that a little bit later. People who have had manic episodes tend to have depressions too, and when they do, we say they have bipolar disorder. What's the heritability of bipolar disorder? It's really high. Remember, for depression, it was only 29% or so in men and 39% or so in women, but for both men and women with bipolar disorder, the heritability is over 80%. Meaning what? That genes you're born with confer a big vulnerability. Genes explain a lot of the reason, the vast majority of the reason, as to why most of us kind of have stable moods most of the time, but a relatively small percentage of the population rapidly and wildly fluctuates in their moods. So genes have a lot to do with bipolar disorder, and there's a lot of labs around the world trying to figure out which genes for norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, and other neurotransmitters might be off base or in a different configuration in people at risk for bipolar disorder. We used to think that bipolar disorder, well, you had it or you didn't. This is a category. But like everything else we're talking about, it's on a continuum. Some people, and you may know people like this, they never get completely manic, but for a couple of days, they're kind of wired, and then a couple of days later, they seem to be really, it's hard to get out of bed, and backache, and really grumpy, and they're kind of always in a little bit of a mood episode. That's called cyclothymia, or cyclothymic disorder. That tends to occur in families where other members have classic bipolar disorder. Then there's something called bipolar type 2, where a person with even out medication treatment starts to have a manic episode, goes into the first phase called hypomania, where you've got mild symptoms, and then without any treatment, the symptoms kind of cap, and you go back into normal mood, and then usually into a depression. And then some people, rarer, have bipolar type 1, where your manias don't just stop at hypomania, they really escalate into very severe forms, and then you level off in your mood, and then you have a depression. So bipolar 1 is the most severe, bipolar 2, only hypomanias and depressions, cyclothymia, not quite manic episodes, not quite depressions alternating, it's on a spectrum, just like everything else. Question?
So I know we talked about how most of disorders in DSM are syndromes, but this is like a heritability provider.
Yeah, so maybe bipolar disorder is a disorder, heritability is really high, genes have a lot to do with it, but we don't have an underlying unifying cause. We don't know which genes, there's some susceptibility genes. There are some people who seem to get bipolar disorder at a very late point in life. Most of the time it happens in your teens or 20s. Some kids may get it. It's still not a disorder, although it's maybe closer, because it's so biological and so heritable, maybe at least some forms of bipolar disorder will actually be a disorder, not a syndrome, okay? Now, of all the things we've talked about in this class, and we'll continue to talk about, ADHD and depression and conduct disorder, there's at least a slight association between The poorer you're grown up, poorer you grow up, conditions you're born into, the more likely you are to have these conditions. What's the exception? Bipolar disorder. The only major mental disorder that has a positive association with social class. So is that because when you get really amped up and manic, you tend to be really productive and very successful? Well, that's sort of true, except that if you go beyond hypomania, you're not very successful at all. You're disorganized and may end up psychotic and in a hospital. Or is it that there's a tendency for people in certain professions, some of the arts, some of the sciences, who are pretty creative, they have a liability to bipolar disorder. And people with bipolar disorder tend to be often pretty wealthy and often pretty successful. This is a mysterious kind of thing, but it's a real fact. It's not just sort of made up. There's something about the risk for bipolar disorder that on average can propel people to do some pretty remarkable accomplishments and actually do better, rise in social class. Who are, if you go across most of the developed world and you look and see who are the entrepreneurs, who are the scientists of real acclaim, who are the sculptors and poets, who are they often? The people whose first degree relatives have bipolar disorder. So maybe if you've got some of the genetic liability, not to the extent that your moods really get dysregulated, but you've got that kind of temperament, you've got that kind of drive, this isn't just a small sample in clinics. Many of the most successful people across societies are closely related to people with bipolar disorder. Maybe a partial genetic loading spurs you to do big things. Well, this sounds all very positive. God, mania? What are the symptoms of hypomania? Increased creativity, increased productivity, increased desire for sex. Hyperacusis, nothing has ever smelled or sounded or tasted as good. As my friend I was a graduate student with, and we ran groups for people with bipolar disorder, on a New Year's card, he listed the symptoms of hypomania: increased productivity, creativity, increased sexual drive, decreased need for sleep, and on the back he said, have a hypomanic New Year. This is the mental disorder everybody wants, right? What's the closest thing you can do? I don't recommend you do it. What's the closest thing you can do to experience a hypomania? Inject yourself with cocaine or snort speed. That dopamine surge mimics some of the symptoms of hypomania. But what's the catch? When the mania abates, or when it starts to combine with depression, or when the depressive episode occurs 6 months later, there is no condition we know of with a higher suicide risk. People with bipolar disorder who don't get treatment, about 1 in 2 will make a serious suicide attempt. And about 20% will complete a suicide. Now, this isn't true, it's kind of lying with statistics, but if you read about, who did you read about yesterday in the paper you might have? Mick Jagger's girlfriend, age 49, committed suicide. My guess is she has bipolar disorder, had bipolar disorder. Maybe it's the kind of person attracted to Mick Jagger, she was a designer, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, but when you think of suicide, there's a lot of reasons for it. Depression's a very salient one. But bipolar disorder, where you alternate manias with depressions, and you've got a lot of impulsivity, many people who think seriously of suicide aren't just depressed, you can't stand that horrible feeling again, and you need to do something quickly. So bipolar disorder is lethal. Yes, it can be associated with good productive things, creative things, but untreated bipolar disorder is a killer. So, we don't have time, this is why you're supposed to be in Psych 130 or taking it before, to go through the stages of mania. In the early stages, for people with bipolar type 1, yeah, hypomania is kind of fun, and I'm staying up late, and I'm feeling good, and I'm doing a lot of great things, and then I move up a few days later, and I start to believe I've been placed on the earth for special reasons. Wait a minute, that's a little delusional, isn't it? That sounds a little psychotic. And now I'm doing really reckless things because I feel I'm invincible, and I can drive my car in city streets at 100 miles an hour. And now, a few days later, if I go into the third phase of mania, I look very much like I have paranoid schizophrenia. Because now my delusions and hallucinations are severe, and I can't take care of myself. So, if a mania goes beyond the first stage to the second and third, usually it's inevitable that hallucinations and delusions occur. So people with severe manias look very much like people with schizophrenia, just in terms of symptoms. What are the delusions of people with mania? Not so much that you have a radio transmitter implanted in your head that's kind of strange, but you believe you are the next savior. Or you've been placed on earth for a special reason because of the powers you have. So often the delusions in mania are congruent with this very expansive, grandiose, euphoric mood. How do you know what's next for somebody who's been in a manic episode? Will they go back to their normal mood and then a few months later get depressed? Or will the depression occur right away? Or not for 3 years? Or will a second manic episode appear before the depression? You don't know. So as a clinician, what do? You get the person, the family, the partner. You spend a long time getting a history. And you plot, oh my God, at age 18 there was the first episode, and it went up a little bit. And at 24 there was a huge up episode, and they ended up in the hospital. And at 27 there was a serious depression. You actually plot, kind of like a sine wave, the episodes up and down. The best predictor is the person's own past. People with bipolar disorder really vary across such individuals as to what that pattern is. What if you start out one day and you wake up after 3 hours boing and you're in that kind of hypomanic state, but a couple of weeks later your energy's up, but you feel that actually all the attempts you've made to be grand have failed and you feel worthless. So your mood is depressed, but your motor is revved up pretty high idle. That's a mixed state or mixed episode. You have some of the symptoms of mania at the same moment as some of the symptoms of depression. Mixed states are the most lethal period because often you get the energy and impulsivity of a manic episode along with the despair and hopelessness of a depressed episode. In very rare cases, you can flip that in some people, and they're lying almost motionless in bed, their energy level is low, but in their mind, they're the next savior. So you could get a different kind of mixed episode where the energy's low, but the mood is high. Mixed states are, if you work clinically in the future, you will learn and you'll be trained to be on the alert for someone in your community mental health center or in your emergency room, someone who's in a mixed episode. You're going to have to rule out whether they're taking speed or they're coming down in a withdrawal from downers, but also get their history, and if they have a bipolar history, a mixed episode is really dangerous. I put it again on this slide because it's so important. The suicide risk is extreme with bipolar disorder. So some people have the classic, my God, for 6 months they were in a manic episode, they returned to normal mood for a year, and then they went into the depths of despair and a depression for 4 months. And then that'll repeat. Sometimes that's called Cage disease. Cage was the Australian psychiatrist who 60 years ago discovered that people with this kind of classic bipolar disorder responded to this salt called lithium. Most people, however, don't have absolutely clear manias and depressions. There's a lot of mixed episodes. And sometimes people cycle in and out of depressions and manias in a way it's hard to tell where one leaves off and the other begins. Bipolar type 2, just to repeat this, would be a person who, even without treatment, doesn't tend to go beyond that first phase of mania. Hypomanias only, alternating with depressions. You'd think that would be a pretty good form of this disorder to have because you don't end up in a mental hospital, because you don't get psychotic. What's the problem? The suicide risk is just as high in bipolar type 2 as it is in bipolar type 1. So the depressions and mixed episodes can be quite severe. Some people, some adults, tend to have not an episode every year or two, but 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 episodes a year. That's called rapid cycling. The cutoff is at least 4 a year. Now this turns out to be important if you stay awake for 10 more minutes, because we think that when kids get bipolar disorder, they tend to be very rapid cyclers. Yeah. It could be 4 mild manias, it could be a mania and a depression, a mania and a depression. 4 of either pole. Why 4? I don't know, it just seems like a good number. I mean, it's somewhat arbitrary. Most people don't have that many episodes a year. When you do, there's probably something more biological going on. So, again, I'm kind of cycling back on some facts I think are important. The biological and genetic risk for bipolar disorder seems very high. However, what is true of many people with bipolar disorder who tend to have the worst types of bipolar disorder, they've been maltreated as kids, physically or sexually. Now that's not heritable, right? That's a psychosocial risk. So when you've got the biological genetic risk for bipolar disorder and you've experienced physical or sexual abuse, there's pretty good data across tens of thousands of people that you're going to have more severe episodes that are harder to treat. Kind of a gene-environment correlation. How many people end up with bipolar disorder? Well, with bipolar type 1, severe mania, severe depression, about 1% of the adult population. Bipolar type 2 added in, 2 to 3%. How many people have unipolar depression, only depressions, with no manias? 7 to 10% of men and 20% of women. So bipolar disorder is much rarer. Having these manic episodes, again, huge genetic risk for this, and it's relatively rare, but it's not totally rare. 2 to 3% is a lot. Is it true that in order to make myself more creative, I should become manic? Is it, well, maybe I should actually take a stimulant. Maybe I should do cocaine. Well, if you're really creative in the first place, having a hypomanic episode is probably a good idea. Ask George Frederick Handel, who wrote The Messiah in 17 days, barely sleeping. It was very clear he was in a manic episode. But if I had a manic episode for 17 days, I would play chopsticks, right? I don't have any musical talent. So you've got to be creative in the first place. It's a myth to think that mania automatically makes you creative. But if you're creative, and you're going for a while without sleep, and you don't go beyond that hypomanic phase, it might temporarily increase your productivity. But what happens to most people with bipolar disorder? You go into the second, third stage, and now your thinking is really off, and now you haven't slept much in a couple of weeks, and you crash and burn and end up in a mixed state. Many artists with bipolar disorder will tell you, well, I used to think I would never get treatment because I was creative and productive, but it was only after I got treatment that I actually ever finished a musical piece, or only actually finished a painting. So it's one thing to have the creative spark, and it's another thing to complete it. So before we start to talk about kids and developmental issues, how do you treat bipolar disorder? If somebody's in a manic episode, how well are they going to do sitting down in a psychologist's office? Not very well, because they'll sit for about 5 minutes and storm out. One-on-one therapy for a person who's floridly manic isn't going to cut it. People who are manic and who've had manic depressive cycles in the past need medication treatment. What medications are used? If you're beyond hypomania, you're going to end up getting a medicine that's usually used for schizophrenia. You're going to get an antipsychotic medication to stop those hallucinations and delusions. And then, when the voices have kind of quelled, you're going to get on a mood-stabilizing medication. Lithium was the first one, started in the 40s, wasn't approved in the United States until 1970. Now a lot of the anti-seizure medications are used. There's other kinds of mood-stabilizing medications. And they tend, if a person takes them regularly, to slow down the manias and depressions and make the normal mood period last longer in between them. They usually don't stop the person, not a cure altogether, but they tend to put a lid on the manias and a floor under the depressions. What if you're really manic and you're not sleeping? Well, you're going to get sleeping pills, or you might get anti-anxiety pills just to calm you down. But for a long time, people said, well, if a person's really manic, you can't put a person in a shrink's office and do any psychotherapy. But we now know that, especially in between episodes, cognitive behavioral treatments and family treatments, where the family is engaged to help the person remember to take their medications, are a tremendous addition to medication. Because what's one of the big problems of medication treatment for people with bipolar disorder? The second you start to feel a little bit hypomanic despite the meds, you think, who needs this shit? I could be really creative and productive again. I'm sick of the side effects of the medication. You flush the pills down the toilet, and then there's no protection anymore, and a manic episode will ensue. So adherence to medication is a big problem for people with high blood pressure and people with heart disease, but it's a big problem, even bigger for people with bipolar disorder, because most people hate the medications if they're going to prevent the next hypomanic episode. So now we're going to talk about kids. Questions about bipolar disorder. Sort of race through in 25 minutes what you might spend a whole lecture or two in Psych 130 about. Questions about these symptoms, about this disorder. Yeah? So there's something called schizoaffective disorder. This is a very poorly defined condition. A cousin of mine had very severe schizoaffective disorder before he committed suicide at age 30. And so he, at age 16, began to have, well, pretty clearly manic episodes. And they didn't stop at hypomania. They went to stage 2 and 3, and